A lost Apache girl was adopted by a cowboy, proved to be a stunning Apache, daughter of a widow. Before we begin the narrative, don't remember to leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and to enjoy the video. The area of New Mexico was dry and vast. Everything it touched was flattened by the late afternoon sun. Dust clung to the air, moving with every wind blow in tiny swirls. Across the scrubland, a man rode leisurely on a bay horse, his big shoulders, black beard, and massive body in the saddle hiding a face that had suffered too many losses and too many storms. He was a rancher named Caleb who had previously resided for reasons other than survival. He had buried a wife in the unborn years prior. She carried the youngster behind a cottonwood close to his property's edge. Since then, the cabin he went back to every night was a hollow shell. He completed his tasks. He made amends. He kept animals alive, but each activity was carried out with a sad sense of obligation rather than optimism. He wasn't cycling for fun that day. He was inspecting a section of fence that frequently drooped following storms and making certain that no strays had gone too far. He hardly touched his pistol belt anymore, although it lay at his side. He desired nothing to do with discussions between guys or fighting. He had long since discovered that on the frontier, death was too simple, and he didn't want to invite any more. At that moment, on a low ridge's edge, he saw movement. He initially believed it to be a slender, wild animal. Out of place against the vast ground, he staggered, but he could see it well when his horse climbed the peak. A young youngster, tiny, she was barefoot, her skin browned by dust and sun, and her legs were scratched raw. She wore a tattered fragment of fabric that could have been a garment. She was no more than 4 years old. Caleb stopped in the saddle with one hand on his thigh and the other on the rein. He didn't want to acknowledge how much his heart pounded. There were several hazards on this land. Just having a child meant something awful had taken place. The possibilities flooded his head. Abandonment, illness, and raid. He looked beyond the horizon, searching in all directions for other people's presence. Smoke, movement, riders, nothing. Only the sound of his horse's breath on a dry wind. The young woman, she slipped and almost fell, but she regained herself and continued to move aimlessly. Caleb dropped from the saddle. The sound of his boots hitting hard earth reverberated through the quiet. He was aware better than hurrying. Her lips were chapped from thirst, her eyes darted, and she was trembling. He held up one hand, indicating that he was unarmed. "Easy," he remarked in a quiet voice. "And stable." She might not understand the term, but tone was important. She froze. Caleb felt a nod in his chest as she planted her feet as though she had nowhere left for Ron. Out of recollection as well as sympathy. Once, when invaders attacked a nearby settlement, he had witnessed children and women wandering in this manner. That same shocked expression as you're cut loose from any familiar source. He detested recalling it, but here it was once more, manifested as a single little girl. He got down on his knees as he leveled himself with her. Her big, dark, and terrified eyes met his. His, albeit briefly, before flicking down once more. In her fist, she clutched a piece of cloth as if it were the only something that keeps her alive. He mumbled, "You're alone," not anticipating her response. Damn. He considered going. She was there because he understood what it would mean to take her in, not because he wanted to. She wasn't his. Accountability. Taking her home was risky. The town's residents were not very patient with Apache kids, especially if as word got out, their bias would also mark him. However, he was also aware that she wouldn't spend another night by herself in the open. She would be taken by coyotes, raiders, or Cole. He made a decision. He slowly opened his arms. She hesitated for a moment, her body stiff. Then something gave way within her. Stumbling forward, she stuffed herself up against him. Her bones felt very light, piercing beneath the skin. Caleb put his arms around her and felt her clench both fists around his shirt. He let out a breath, knowing that he had just made a decision he couldn't reverse. He steadied himself. She was brought to the horse by him. She recoiled at the animal's snort, but Caleb murmured softly to the youngster and beast, soothing them. After putting her in the saddle, he ascended behind her. His chest was crushed against his little back. She remained motionless and didn't say anything. The tattered cloth was still tightly held. Every mile dragged heavily as he led the horse home. While riding, Caleb's the mind worked hard. Who was she? From where did she come? Was she being sought after? How she held on to he told him enough. She was alone. Not anymore anyway. He recalled the tomb beneath the cottonwood. The long evenings of silence, the emptiness of his cabin. Something within him changed. It reminded him of everything he had lost, and he didn't enjoy how much it hurt. When the cabin arrived into view, The logs glowed with the last of the daylight as the sun had sunk low. From the chimney, smoke curled faintly. He got off his horse and brought her inside, using his shoulder to push the door open. Old leather and wood smoke filled the air. The tiny cabin had a single main room with a bed pressed up against the wall, a rough-hewn table, and a stove. He placed her next to the fireplace on a folded quilt. Without resistance, she sat with her arms wrapped about her body and her legs crossed. Caleb filled a tin cup with water and presented it. She grabbed it with both hands and drank quickly until water poured out, her chin. He allowed her, but as she choked, he used his hand to slow her down. He stirred while he boiled beans in an iron kettle. Slow. He gave her tiny spoonfuls as they grew softer. She pretended not to eat. Coughed once and then slowed down, not seeing food in days. He remained calm, holding steady the spoon until her stomach relaxed. He then proceeded to a shelf and he put down a rag doll that he hadn't touched in years. It was embroidered by his wife in an attempt to fill the cradle that never had a child. The only reason Caleb had kept it was because he couldn't bring himself to discard it. Giving it to the person now felt odd, like revealing a fragment of an incomplete project. The girl grabbed it with both hands and pressed it against her chest. For the first time since he had discovered her, her shoulders relaxed and her breathing slowed. The doll nestled up with her, eyelids heavy against the quilt. She fell asleep in a matter of minutes. The crackle of her delicate breaths were covered by the fire. Leaning forward in his chair, Caleb clasped hands. As he observed her, he felt the burden of decision weigh more heavily than before. He had desired to live by himself, to stay away from pain and ties, but something new had just come his way. He considered taking her to town, but it would require stares he didn't want and inquiries he couldn't answer. No, he was aware. He was already refusing to let her go. He looked out the window at the burial and back. The mound just visible in the light is fading. Regarding a child resting by their fire, he pondered what his wife might have said and thought. He allowed the thought to linger even as his chest constricted. The girl moved once, gripping the doll more tightly, and the cabin didn't feel completely empty for the first time in years. When morning arrived, gloomy, with a slight chill slipping through the cabin wall's crevices. Caleb, he got up early as usual because he had been rising before the dawn for years. The blaze had burnt low, with the ash pan showing only dim coals. He forced himself to get out of the recliner he had been sleeping in, half-seated and turned to face the fireplace. The toddler remained there, tightly coiled, with the rag doll pushed against close to her chest. Her breathing had been steady and even, but she hadn't moved much during the night. For the first time, she appeared safe because he had located her. After putting on his boots, he went outdoors into the gloom. The terrain was silent save for the little sound of brush rustling in the wind. The animals down at the post and the post itself were stamped by his horse. Their quiet calls came from the creek. After carrying the bucket of water inside, he placed it on the stove and added wood, till the flames flared up once more. The room was filled with the warm, odorous scent of smoke. Recognizable. The child sat up swiftly, her eyes wide, and she clutched the doll as though it could disappear. Not wishing to shock her, Caleb remained at the back. She glanced at him, unsure, but she just nodded once and muttered, "Morning," did not cry. He gestured for her to sip from a tin cup of warm water he had placed next to her quilt. She kept a careful eye on him, then took it after reaching out with both hands. His mind was ablaze with questions. Who was she? Where had she gone? From where? Was she still being sought after? He had decided to keep her under his roof the previous evening, because for her, the alternative meant death. He was aware that it couldn't stop there, though. A family was represented by a youngster traveling alone, ripped apart. He had to think about the possibility that her people might search and the implications for him. He immediately thought of the town for a half day. The men there were already suspicious of him because he retained himself. Exposing an Apache youngster to the public might raise concerns and far worse, judgment. When those queries arose, he wasn't yet certain of his response. He offered her leftover beans from the previous evening. She ate slowly this time, warmed in the pan, and looked at him after every bite as though awaiting approval. Her arms were slender, he saw. How tired she was, hunching her shoulders forward. She had already survived, but not by much. He recalled evenings. Following raids, he witnessed women and children in the same condition, half broken and half starved, but still clinging to existence. Inside of him, something hardened once again. He refused to let her suffer that fate. When she finished eating, he tugged on his hat and gestured for her to follow him out into the yard. After hesitating, she followed him, holding the doll tightly. After guiding her to the trough, he filled a tiny bucket and demonstrated how to squirt her with water. Face. Shivering from the cold, she imitated him without grumbling. He squatted down, gave her a cloth, and dabbed at her face. When he looked closely, he saw that she had scrapes on her legs and a deepening bruise close to her knee. He could tell she was already there because she didn't resist his touch. Starting to have faith in him, his mind pressed harder as he labored. He became aware that he had not given her a name to refer to him by, and she hadn't said anything. She might not have understood English. Or perhaps she was just too scared. He pondered whether she would ever tell him the name her mother had given her. He refrained from pushing. There was a silence that he comprehended more thoroughly than most. He went back inside, placed her close to the fireplace once more, and grabbed his coat. He needed to do some work. Take action. He couldn't leave her alone, but he couldn't disregard the fences or the necessity to keep an eye on the cattle. Not quite yet. Kneeling before her, he pointed to the fire and the quilt. "Remain here," he said, murmured slowly, gesturing toward the floor. She gave him a wide-eyed look and tightened her grip on the doll, but gave the smallest nod. He mounted his horse and made a brief circuit of the grounds, feeling uneasy the whole time. He was familiar with the tales of Apache families, and every sound seemed to portend the return of invaders. Children are stolen or killed, women are widowed, and if this girl had been abandoned following an attack, then he thought of the mother who was grieving someplace and felt the weight of it hang heavily on him. Lost a spouse, an unborn child, and the idea of a woman who is lost and believes. When he arrived, the cabin door was still closed, smoke curling from her little one's absence, which caused his chest to clench. The chimney. When he entered, she was standing exactly where he had left her, holding the doll, and she gave him a look that seemed to, for the first time. He saw her shoulders relax, and he nodded briefly to make sure he hadn't left her. Each stroke of the axe was heavy, and that afternoon he placed her on the porch to enjoy the sun as he cut wood nearby. She remained motionless, her legs up to her chest, yet his gaze continued to stray toward her. However, her eyes were always on the ground, listening for any sound. Caleb felt a low level of fury as he saw the expression of someone who anticipated danger at every turn. In him. The men who had abandoned her in this state, not her. She was merely a youngster, but she carried the burden of anxiety as though she had endured years of it. He sat at the table opposite her that night as the sky turned orange, tearing bread in two. Gave her a slice, and as their hands briefly met, he felt her tiny fingers tense and then relax. It hit for years. It felt natural to eat with him across that old table once more. The chair across from him was unoccupied when he ate by himself, but now, even in silence, there Caleb slumped back in his chair, the girl sleeping again on the quilt as a fire burnt down that night. He had vowed never to let his heart open, and he thought of the grave outside and the woman who lay under it. Once more, never to bear the burden of another person's reliance on him. But here it was, imposed by circumstance. He understood the truth, but he couldn't deny that he had already made up his mind, and the girl wasn't leaving. She had a mother, and when she arrived, Caleb would have to deal with whatever she brought. He had accepted this, but he wasn't sure yet if it would lead to greater sorrow or tranquility. He just knew that he couldn't leave, child in, and he would stick to that decision regardless of any questions. That night, with the desert wind, Caleb Rohr felt a sense of obligation attached to the cabin walls that he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't call for a hope because he wasn't prepared for that, but he sensed the stirring of something more profound than duty alone. Nevertheless, it kept him up late, and the following day arrived with a strong wind rattling the scrubland. A sound that reverberated far and caused the walls of the cabin to tremble. Caleb went outside before dawn, looking across the horizon as usual, but this time he did so with more acute vigilance. The toddler was inside, still asleep, holding the doll tightly. He was afraid of abandoning her even for a few minutes, but the animals needed to be cared for, so he hurried, carrying water. His mind kept returning to the same questions as he checked the corral. Where was her family? Who had abandoned her? First and foremost, was she being sought after? By mid-morning, the girl had followed him outside. Her prints was left in the dust by her tiny bare feet, and she watched him split logs while he placed her on the porch with a blanket. Caleb observed how she was silent, her eyes wide but more composed than before. As though she needed something sturdy behind her, he kept it at her back and leaned against the cabin wall. Recalled soldiers having the same instinct after a battle, never putting their trust in ground. He put down the axe and knelt beside her, realizing that a child's stomach would not be able to handle such anxiety. He whispered, "You've got a name," but he wasn't expecting a response. She blinked. He delicately caressed his chest, and she watched as her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound emerged. Caleb waited, then glanced down. No response. He let it go because it wouldn't help to force her. Inside, warm bread and beans. She looked up with a flash of something he hadn't yet noticed when he handed the dish to her. She was hesitant, almost ashamed, but it was obvious that she was accustomed to hunger. He moved the platter closer, and she began eating little morsels, but not to someone who was always providing food. Then quicker till she slowed once more, and he saw that her eyes had softened a little, hint of trust starting to appear. The girl abruptly stiffened that afternoon as Caleb was repairing the corral. He followed her eyes and noticed a figure moving through the brush, walking slowly but steadily toward the ridge. Purpose. With instincts firing sharply, his hand moved to the weapon that was leaning close. As the figure approached, the shape solidified into a woman with bronze skin. She wore a deerskin outfit and had long black hair braided with leather strips. Torn across the front and dirty from hard miles, it was trimmed with beads. Caleb felt his throat tighten, knowing before she spoke that her body swayed with fatigue, but her steps remained steady. Who she must be. He glanced at the girl who had frozen, her gaze fixed on the woman who was coming. Then, abruptly, the child let out a cry, staggered forward and ran directly into her arms, lowering herself to her knees and holding the girl close to her chest. The force of it made her slender arms tremble, and she made a sound that was part laugh and half sob. She pressed her face into the child's hair, while whispering something Caleb didn't understand but knew was relieved. Just enough back to look over the girl, caressing her arms and face as though to confirm that everything was still there. Then, unable to release her grip, she grabbed her once again. Caleb was a few steps away. When the woman finally looked up at him, he saw the truth in her eyes as the rifle lowered and his heart raced. Grief still clung to her, etched into her bones, after she believed her daughter had lost. However, shock and relief had now shattered it open, and she stood up unsteadily, grasping that Caleb noticed the girl's thinness as she braced her side with her other arm. It was the way her collarbone pressed hard against her skin, the way her ripped seam garment showed not only curves but also travel-related rawness and bruises. He averted his gaze for a second, letting her dignity, then made his voice steady. "I found her 2 days ago, and she was by herself." Her lips parted, and she said in halting English, "You protect her." Her voice shook, hoarse from silence and thirst. Caleb gave one nod. She had been fed. She swayed, warm. And he. She fought his arm at first, proud, but he moved ahead before she collapsed. She allowed him to hold her once her strength failed, and he led her inside the cabin, where he cleared the chair for her, carefully placed her down, and filled a tin cup with water, which she quickly drank. He steadied the cup, slowing her down, and she coughed just like a girl had. Caleb noticed the girl's stillness as she clung to her mother's side, still holding the doll, her eyes flickering between them. Had been due to fear rather than a lack of speech. She now whispered gently into her mother's shoulder. Little her first sound since he'd found her was words in Apache, and Caleb leaned against the table with his arms folded. Attempting to sort out the questions he was trying to answer, he said softly, "What happened?" The woman's eyes grew black. "Raiders," she said haltingly. "They kill my husband." She touched the girl's head, though, and I feared my baby was gone. "I search, always search." Her voice trembled. Caleb lowered his sight, his jaw clenched, knowing that type of loss, but she steadied it with will. Eyes too well. The woman's suffering affected him deeply as he remembered the grave beyond the cottage and the years of desolation that followed. Because it was familiar. The cabin remained quiet for a while, except for the girl's gentle voice and the crackle of the fire. Caleb took a youngster he believed had no one, and he realized then that everything had changed once more. The mother stared at him from his hut, still alive but hollowed out by sorrow. He made a decision the same way he did 2 nights prior, with tired eyes that begged more than words could possibly express. "You'll both stay," he replied plainly and firmly, without hesitating once the reality was in front of him. The woman blinked, shocked as if she hadn't anticipated a stranger's generosity. She nodded slowly, but her lips quivered. The girl reassured her by pressing closer, but her gaze kept going to Caleb instead of this time, with recognition, but with terror. Instead of 2 persons, the cabin could accommodate 3 that night. The young woman Caleb sat by the fire, silent and alert, while the mother slept on the duvet between them, her arm wrapped about her. He reflected on how fast his life had changed, how he had gone from years of being alone to this, 2 lives now being confined to his. And even though it weighed heavily, he sensed something else.